Well, welcome everybody. You made it out here on a pretty crummy night, but you know, spring's right around the corner, so that's good, right? So my name is Mark Gilbert. I'm not related to Gilbert Bennett at all, but I did work for Steve as his assistant almost 40 years ago in Boston, Mr. Dunwell, and it was a great experience. And you know, I reached out to Steve a few months back, and I said, you know, this would be lovely if you could come to Reading and share some of your knowledge and your artwork and your thinking about the role of water power in building industry. And so tonight's talk, it's actually going to be very interesting. You're going to see some wonderful photographs and art. You're also going to feel like you're in a sociology class or in a class about labor relations or you know, learning about the Industrial Revolution. And Steve has done a huge amount of scholarly work on this topic, and I think we will all have a great time. Steve Dunwell.
Hey, thanks. Thank you, Mark, for that intro. I appreciate it. And just like as a way of getting into the subject, the reason I know about this community and the Gilbert Bennett story is because my aunt and uncle lived in Meadow Ridge for a dozen years, and I visited them quite a few times. And I've got like special radar that tingles when there's a mill nearby, and it was tingling a lot at Meadow Ridge. So I would go across the Twain. I'll see you guys in a couple hours, and I would come down here and look around. And each time I was interested, but puzzled, a little like, what am I seeing? So I'm going to try to tell you a little story about the Gilbert Bennett Mill, the town of Georgetown, and the arc of history that goes from that beginning to the present. I'll be mostly referencing slides because I'm a very visual person. And I'm going to start with this one. This is the waterfall that is inside the Gilbert Bennett factory. Sometimes I'll say G&B because it's a little quicker, right? So this is the waterfall as it was 2 weeks ago. I came down for a little recon, and you can see there it is. The turbine building was on the right-hand side. And keep in mind that when you see a mill water dam with water coming over the top, that's actually the excess water. If the mill was operating, the water would go the other way through the turbine and out back. But here we're seeing like all of the flow there is going along like that. I start here in part because water power, I think, is the key to understanding New England industry, and certainly the key to understanding the distribution of factory villages, of which Georgetown is one. This water power is somewhat small on the scale of things. I'll come back to that in a sec, but it's a way to visualize, okay, we've got buildings and we've got water and they're adjacent. And the power source is the falling of the water. And the amount of power you get depends on how far it falls, what is the height, and what is the volume of water that's coming along as the flow. So you can have, you know, a little and a lot, or a lot and a little. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this, but mostly around here we're talking about rather small water power sites. But still, just to dramatize, I like to show examples. This one is in Fitchburg, a rather small stream, but on a day with a lot of flow. You can see the buildings up above. The water source, really, the water conduit up there is really a big wooden pipe that leads the water along. Okay? And this is what the waterfall in Waltham looks like, near where I live. I'm from Boston. This is the Charles River at Waltham. And at this point, this water power is about 500 horsepower. The one that you have is quite a bit smaller. My guess, I'm going to go back to it for a sec, is that it might be 200 or less, but still significant, but not as big as some of the others, and they got a whole lot bigger, and I'll come back to that. So in the early days of manufacturing in the United States, typically we're talking about the period from right after the Revolution, but especially the 1790s, 1800, that time period, where they were mostly done with the fighting and they had to figure out, now what are we going to do? They there was a big debate about should we have factories or no factories. Jefferson wanted like no factories. He wanted, you know, a rural kind of a country. Hancock and Hamilton wanted to have a more robust manufacturing. So we debated about that. But whatever they were going to do, they had to find a way to operate these factories, you know. And the only way at that time was to go to a place that had water power. Well, you could actually get a mule and have the mule walk in a circle, or maybe walk on a treadmill, or something like that. They're a very inefficient way to do things. But if you wanted to grind grain, or process cloth, or run a spinning frame, whatever that was, you needed to go to a water power location. So I made this little diagram just to remind us that the factory is just a building, okay? You've got inputs like raw materials and labor and capital and machinery. You've got the output, which is the finished goods. The only thing that is not portable, that can't be moved, is the power source, because there was no electricity, there was no steam, there were no steam engines, none of those things, nada. So if you wanted to have something go around in a circle with some force, you would go where the waterfall was. And now, then the next question is, well, which waterfall are you going to choose? Some of them are much too big. One of the first places that they started working with was Paterson, New Jersey. A huge thing. It's like a mini Niagara almost. Didn't work out too big. Other places they tried a smaller one, like in Slater Mill in Pawtucket. That was a really important start. But many times they would, a person who wanted to build this kind of industry would go to a place where the hydro opportunity was manageable, like not too big and not too small, kind of a Goldilocks situation, because you had to build all this stuff. You had to build the dam, you had to build the hydraulics, the canals and the races and all those kind of things, the wheels, the machines. You had to have the building for it. All of that investment should be justified by the likelihood of success, right? So you would find a water power opportunity that was not so big that you couldn't trap it, so to speak. If you chose something that was too big, it would just blow out in the first big storm, right? Big, like rainstorm. They called it a freshet back in the day. It would like rain and rain and rain, and the water all comes streaming down and blows out the dams and things like that. This is an example of the paradigm that we're talking about. Small factories in rural settings. This one was in North Adams. This is the all-important Boston Manufacturing Company at Waltham. This painting was done in 1824. Waltham actually started 10 years before that. So they started with one building, they were successful, they put a second one in. Waltham was the place where they first used a water-powered loom and spinning in the same building. So raw material came in one end and finished product went out the other end, which was an unusual and special thing. This is an important historic site. And just a reminder, too, of how rural these situations were, these communities. We've got, the horse, we've got, some other animals, we've got the little village there. Here, I'm trying, using my little pointer. That's a little factory village, and the two buildings over there, the rivers here. So, a smart entrepreneur wanting to get into this business would look for a place that wasn't too big, where the ability to build was somewhat manageable, and start to build out at that place. Here's another example in Rhode Island. This is Forestdale, which is adjacent to Slatersville. I'll show you that in a second. Forestdale started with a much smaller building. You can see how the old building is in the center, okay, and the waterfall is down here. And then they would grow and they would add on to it. Slatersville looks like this now. Originally it was smaller. This is the second iteration of Slatersville. But just to give you a sense of why they went here, this place, the river, it's a small river, but it drops 40 feet in 1 mile. So you've got like a substantial drop, we call that the head, and you could tap that and make a, 1 or 2 dams, put your factories in there, and capture that water. when you make a factory in a rural setting, you're going to need workers. Well, where are they going to come from? Most of them, maybe they would come from nearby farms. Or if you couldn't get enough labor from that locale, you would bring labor in. You would hire people and put them into buildings that you made. So this is an example of Arctic, Rhode Island. It's near West Warwick. And clearly you can see the factory and the housing. And this pattern is repeated many, many times. I'm going to stand in a different place because if I can't do it, thanks. West Hartford, that's fine. So this pattern became like almost a prototype for developments all over New England, where you had a somewhat small water power source in what had been a rural setting, where housing had to be created and other ancillary things to it, like a store and other features. Usually there'd be a railroad, almost always. So you've got the railroad, you've got the river, you've got the dam, you've got the housing, you've got the factory, all together. And the variable factor in this comes from the geography, which is different in each of these settings. You always have like a river, a dam, a pond, all that kind of thing. But some are flatter and some are more, in a valley, and it varies quite a lot. Okay. Now here at Georgetown, Mr. Gilbert came here in 1824. Benjamin Gilbert did, and he started at what would now be called the lower factory. This is a point I'll come back to this, but it's something that I had to kind of try to learn more about. Because the factory that you see now is the upper factory. It's like the second factory setting. There was another one down the road. You go to Old Mill Road, and this one this is an enlargement, obviously, of that. If you go down Old Mill Road, and there's a point where the train track crosses the river, and just below that is where the other factory was, the lower factory. That's where Benjamin Gilbert went. And when you go there now, there's nothing to see. It's like I just came back from there a couple hours ago, looked at it again, I still don't get it. It's like, where did it go? It's like the incredible disappearing factory, but it was a significant site. And it was already in operation as a sawmill before Gilbert came. So someone had already set this up. He already had a dam and a water wheel. Gilbert needed some power to run his business, and so he probably made an arrangement with the first guy and said, how about this, like, I'll lease some of your power. I'll pay you, you let me run my thing, every, like 3 hours a day or whatever it is, some kind of way of dividing the power, and then eventually Gilbert took over that site. The other guy was out, and he expanded it to become a much more robust factory. But it was the lower factory there. So where is that? Down in this part. This is the upper factory here. Okay, so we're up here at the library, but this is the mill pond that you know, and this is about where the granite church is, like right about there. That's the upper one, and this is the lower one. Okay, we'll come back to this later because it's really an important part of understanding the Georgetown story. So he came to the lower factory, which had a smaller power source, water power only. He came in 1824. Remember, no steam at that point. Of course, the railroad had not arrived at that point either. So he was only there for the water, which happened a lot. You'd come for the power because it's the only place where you could actually get a machine to move. How else would you do it? So that was what he did. Now I'm going to show you a couple other examples of this. It's hard to understand in a photograph the topography, the distance in height. This is Harrisville in New Hampshire, another classic mill village. We've got, the first mill was this one over here. Obviously, that's the mill pond over there, church. That was the first mill. This is the second one. But the river goes this way and drops, I don't know, maybe 50 feet or so in that distance, so that you could, each time it dropped 15 or 20 feet, you could put it on a building again. And we'll see this pattern in other places too. So you put the buildings in the places where you can make this work. And you work with the artisans, the masons and the contractors and those kind of guys who would know how to make it work. This one is Newton Upper Falls, which is just outside of Boston, obviously. And this is a piece of the Charles River. The river is coming this way, the waterfall is in there. It's a little confusing because there was some suds that day. That's sudsy water, that is. But this gives that feeling for it's the factory in the valley, which is one of the paradigms that we'll be talking about. The factory is in a valley because that's where the power is. Okay, Willimantic, a much more robust opportunity, bigger river, and in Willimantic there are several, I think there might be 6 of them that are in a row, where goes drop, put a factory in, drop some more, put another one in. So there are buildings in a row as the water continues to fall down. There. This is another way of visualizing this. So if you've got water power and it's created by a wheel or a turbine or something like that, how are you going to get that power to all the places in the mill where you need it? The answer to that was belt drive. So they've got to have shafts and belts to convey the power from the lower part of the building where the water wheels are, these are turbines, to the upper part where the machines are. So that's one of the reasons why these old mills tend to be more vertical. They also stayed rather narrow because you had to allow light to come in from the sides. Again, no electricity. The only way to illuminate the inside, you had window light or you would have like a lamp of some kind, like whale oil or something. Not sure exactly what kind of oil they were burning, but they were illuminating the inside with a very weak light sources. So they tended to make them narrow because the window light would come in more, and because you could also get this power system going up through the building. What that means, though, is that, again, you can't spread out very much from that particular waterfall. It's actually easier to say, well, let's make another building, and we'll put it, like a quarter mile down the road. So in a way, that's what happened here at Georgetown. You had the lower factory first, but there was another waterfall at the upper, where the upper factory eventually was. And they're like about 1.5 miles apart, something like that. Again, we'll come back to this, but I want to use that map again. Okay, so Gilbert was already here for 15 years or so, before he got into the business of weaving with wire. Okay? Before that, he had a different business. He made these sieves for straining things, and someone here probably knows all about it and can explain how that business worked, but it was a completely different business. Eventually, he got into this weaving with wire thing, and he started doing that here in 1835. And by that time, the power loom for real textiles, fabric like this, had already been in operation for 25 years. Because the first power looms were 1814, so about 20 years. And to weave wire, though, you need a much more robust, stronger machine, obviously. You can only make the wire so thin. It's a lot harder to do. So he started off trying to use machines that were made by other manufacturers. And then eventually, I think he had to customize them and make his own designs so that he could make these woven wire products. Also, I imagine that it takes quite a lot of power to make a woven wire loom crank over, more than with a fine fabric loom. It kind of goes like that, whereas I think the other ones are more like clunk, clunk, clunk. It would have to be, right? So he started doing that in 1835 at the lower privilege, the lower factory site. And by the way, the word privilege is an old-fashioned hydro word that describes the fact that you can buy and sell the privilege to use the water. Okay? So you could buy the land, but the next thing is we say, well, I want the land and the privilege, which means I can put a dam in here and it'll be legal. And there were lots and lots of lawsuits about what happened with these privileges. It was too much, and you flooded my land, and you ruined my crop, and all kinds of things like that. But a privilege was a thing you could buy and sell, and it described the ability to dam the river and capture that power. Okay, so in 1848, having already, it's like 13 years later, he needed to expand. He already was successful with the lower one, and so he then thought, I'll expand and I'll go to the upper privilege. And there was, again, it was a sawmill there already, and he made a partnership, and then he eventually took that over. People in here who are experts on this can tell you all the details about how this happened, but that was kind of the big picture. So he moved to the upper privilege and started to build out there, 1848. Now, here's just a reminder of what those looms might have looked like. What the prototype, what does a loom look like, okay? These are engravings from the 19th century that just show a little bit of what that's like. This is a rare daguerreotype showing a loom that was actually in the factory. Someone put a background behind it. Again, a woman with it to give you scale. And a couple other engravings just to kind of give you that flavor for what does a room full of looms look like. Keeping in mind that the machines that Gilbert was making and using had to be stronger than these are. These are kind of fancy things. Okay, so he's in the weaving wire business now and expanding. Well, at the same time, the country is going through this very rocky economic start and stop kind of evolution. They would have setbacks that were called panics. The Panic of 37, and another one, the Panic of 73. We'll get to that one in a bit. Somehow, Gilbert managed to weather that. Usually, you would contract, lay people off, and try to kind of put your creditors off for a while until business resumed. And the banking system was very weak. That's also why there were so many different banks, including this amazing manufacturer's bank. Keeping in mind, by the way, notice that there are children in here. Do that. Child labor was commonplace. It was, everyone expected that, especially in these smaller operations. And if you had a big family and you had a lot of children, you might send a couple of them to the mill and they would help you, pay the rent or something like that. So this combines two themes. One is the need for capital and the economic boom and bust cycle, but also the child labor cycle too. So these kids are attending a weaving, a spinning frame up here, and just showing that everyone thought child labor was typical, just fine. We would be shocked to have this kind of thing, but they thought it was okay. All right, so back to the expansion of the business. So now he's got his looms, he's working he was at the lower privilege, now he's expanding to the upper one. This map, by the way, is from 1867. Now, 1867, that's after the Civil War. So he's already been in the weaving business now, 48, 58, it's like 19 years he's been doing this. And when you look closely at this map up here, you'll see, well, I have to do it in two steps. This one, we'll look here first, okay? So he's got a siding, and he's got, it says Weave Factory, Gilbert Bennett, okay? And you go up here, Wire Fac, F-A-C, Factory. 2 wire factories down there, which is down on Old Mill Road, where you can't even find them anymore. Now, if you switch to the upper factory, you read closely, it says Gilbert and Bennett, Sawmill, Glue, and Sieve Factory. They were not weaving wire up there. They were doing it at the other one, even as late as 1867. So you can see the business grew, incrementally. They would expand, they'd, try different things out, they would change the machinery, he moved to the upper privilege, which had more power, they rebuilt the dam. The upper privilege also had a bigger pond, and I should say, not just one person, Gilbert and Bennett, their partners and family members and so forth. they also took control of another pond, I think it's called Great Pond, maybe someone can correct me on that, that's a couple miles up the road.
Yeah.
So Great Pond feeds into the mill pond that is above here. So he had more water, more control, more flow, all of that. So I found it remarkable that the Gilbert and Bennett Company had not yet begun weaving wire at the upper privilege, even as late as 1867. And 7 years later, in 1874, this one burned down, the factory up there, which maybe they had some weaving there at that time. So in 1874 was a really big turning point in this story. I'll slide back to that in just a second, but I want to mention too that the water power that comes from that dam I showed you at the beginning, it's not that much. A couple hundred horsepower, maybe. I think even between the two factories, I'm guessing 200 might be a reasonable guess. I tried to find it out, couldn't find documentation on it. Maybe someone could. So they would bring in steam engines to power the expanding number of machines that were bigger and stronger and heavier and needed more. And so the first steam engines here were probably, I would say, like around 1850-ish. Again, I don't have a solid date on that. But to make a steam engine run, you pretty much need coal. And to bring coal in, you pretty much need the railroad. So they had to get the railroad first, and the siding, and then the engine, and all of that. But that is how these companies would expand. They'd start with the water power, and then they would add steam. Well, you might ask, well, why not just go to Norwalk, where there's the whole pile of coal down there, do that. Well, I think what happened was that there's a lot of inertia also. If you start a business in one place, you might be inclined to keep it there. Even if it's not really the very best place, it's your place. And that's, I think, what happened with Gilbert and Bennett. They started at the lower privilege, things were okay, they expanded, they added a weaving, they added some steam, they moved to the second privilege, things were okay, they had the lake, they had some water power, the railroad came, so it all seemed to be working, except that you have to recognize that this is a very difficult way to build a factory, where nowadays you would just say, well, give me a completely flat and level place, and I'll just bring the electricity in and I'll drive my forklifts around and do all that stuff. Well, they didn't do that. Okay, so this is an example of a somewhat small steam engine, just to give you a sense of the scale, because that's also, of course, the steam engine was the railroad. And as we now think of much larger things like this, these engines were at the Lawrence Print Company in Lawrence, Mass. And these are enormous, but they came slower, okay? So in 1874, that upper factory burned, and the company completely reorganized itself also in a fantastic way. Gilbert and Bennett were able to bring other investors in and create what we call a joint stock corporation. So they could capitalize at a higher level, they had to, because they were going to rebuild this whole thing. They still had the dam, they had the water, but they did not have the building, right? It's gone. And so they recapitalized and started to build. So most of the build out at the upper factory, almost all of it really, is after 1874. At that point, the company has already been around for 50 years. Okay, the next thing is when they rebuilt that dam, they also brought in a turbine. There might have been other turbines before, but a turbine, whatever, I would say a turbine, is a much more efficient way of getting the juice out of the water power. There's less waste, right? So you throw away the old wooden water wheel, bring in a fancy new turbine, and you get more power that you can use. And this is just one example of what these things look like. It's also a totally lovely drawing made by James Francis, who was the director of Locks and Canals in Lowell, about 1848. So everyone was converting the turbines, and they did that here as well. This is another view of that waterfall. The turbine building is over here, okay, and the waterfall is over there. Keeping in mind that when in normal operation, that most of the water goes through the building. It does not go over the top of the waterfall. The top of the waterfall is just waste. It's like leftover. So there was another pattern in the 1870s, 80s, 90s of these larger factories being created around larger water power opportunities with bigger turbines, and in places where sometimes there was, again, rural places, no infrastructure, no housing. So there was a kind of a paradigm that was developing of having a large factory with a village nearby where one company owned everything. And in many cases, it was all designed pretty much at the same time, which gives them a lot of uniformity. This one is Pontiac, Rhode Island, which is right next to the Warwick Mall. By the way, it's like, the Warwick Mall is like right over here, it's like, oh, over there. Okay, so that was Pontiac. This is Naugatuck, just to try to show you something local here. I'm not sure if you can make out these circles, but Naugatuck has at least 6 of these sites within the city limits, so to speak. I drew little circles. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, if you count them that way. And the river goes this way. You can see the dam right there. Okay, and then the canal goes off the dam and goes this way, and then goes down into those buildings. So Naugatuck is another example of how a factory community would grow up. And because the water opportunities are sort of spread out, slightly different places, you end up having to duplicate the housing in many cases so that people don't have to walk too far. For example, Judy here was telling me that her great-grandfather, who worked at Gilbert and Bennett, walked almost 4 miles.
Well, you know, it's
More
interesting
than 2,
because
right?
I didn't know if it was the lower, you had reminded me about the lower one. So because I don't know if it was the lower one or the one right downtown in Georgetown, that was the granite, I don't know which one.
But
now.
either way, it was more than 2
But
miles.
it was so far, yeah.
It was far. And you have to imagine, how far would you walk to work? If you were walking in the winter or in the dark, and you didn't have your down parka and all that, you know, it's like, for me, the answer would be, I think 20 minutes, and that would be it. But maybe then they would go further. But still, you can't expect people to walk very far to get to the factory. Therefore, the factory must provide housing. And sometimes they would do it by making like little rows. There are other examples of that, different patterns. This one, Salesville is in, again, sort of the Warwick area, Cranston, Rhode Island, which, by the way, Cranston and Warwick have a lot of this type of development there. This is, I'll say Panama, that's how I like to pronounce it. Some people say Panama. It's near Norwich, Connecticut, okay, the other end of the state. And this building, they say, was one of the largest textile manufacturing buildings in the world when it was built. It's enormous. It's almost a quarter mile long. And it gets the power from the river over here. And I think about, I'll show you the graphic in a second, 1,800 horsepower, something like that, 2,000 around there. No, I take it back. There's more like an 800 for this one. There'll be other examples of that. And the town was built over here. So there are rows and rows and rows of houses in Taftville, which is the home of the Panama or Panama factory. A remarkable site, by the way, still there. Oh, wrong one. That one. Okay, so this is a chart of Waterpower, and you guys are up here. Gilbert and Bennett is like less than Waltham. It's like way up in there. I'll show you a bit of Putnam, North Groverdale, Panama. We just talked about 1,500. Forgive me for getting the number wrong. Okay? Now the other big ones are way, way bigger. But those are the famous ones, the Lowells, the Lawrences, Biddeford, Manchester, that kind of thing. Okay. So we're sticking with the small scale because that's more relevant to the Georgetown story. This one is Ashton, Rhode Island, and you can very quickly pick up the Blackstone River, Okay, the old Blackstone Canal was over here. There's the factory, and there's the housing right there. Like little cute little rows of brick houses with pitched roofs. And that whole thing was like one community right there. The next town was up here. The other next town was down there. So you separated by a couple of miles as the river drops and drops and drops. So that's an example for Ashton. Again, this repeating pattern of the rural location, a hydro site, a factory, and housing nearby. Ansonia. Now, I only recently kind of got hooked on this place. I saw it a couple times before, drove by it recently, and thought, holy moly, this is, you know, a factory on steroids, and a problem on steroids too, and you might agree. So that's what Ansonia looked like. I took this picture about 15 years ago. Obviously an aerial picture. And by the way, it's hard to kind of pick it up. Whoa, back. There, pointer. It has 1, 2, 3 churches within walking distance of the factory. Ansonia is a bigger situation than what we're really talking about, but it's nearby. A lot of you know about it, and it's kind of like a point of reference. Okay, so Ansonia, this one is White Rock in Rhode Island. This is the river. The water power comes in this way, and you can see the factory village down there. Okay? So you kind of get an idea. Now this is Grosvenordale, Connecticut. Grosvenordale is on the Quinebaug River. It's way up in that corner of Connecticut, okay? Almost where Rhode Island and Massachusetts come together, near Pomfret, that kind of thing, north of Putnam, north of Danielson. I'm not sure how frequently people from here go over there, but it's very, very interesting. And I think that this place is one of the most extraordinary prototype mill villages that we have. The water power there was about 670 horsepower, and this is what it looks like today. A drone picture I took a couple of years ago. So you can see the factory, pond, hydro comes down this way, and then they had distinctive areas of housing. This one was called, guess what? 3 rows. And then across from that, they had a thing over here that was called Little Canada. This is kind of typical. They'd say the acre, that's where the Irish would live, Little Canada, you know, Polish town. There was a lot of that naming that you'd see. But this is a preserved historic district, and really an interesting place to visit because it's like a classic. Way out in the country, nothing around nearby, and you know, a fantastic setup. Okay, so Gilbert and Bennett had their upper factory. The dam, by the way, would be over here. Okay, the river kind of comes down this way, comes around. Notice the smokestack. They're burning coal. There's the railroad, steam. Okay, and then the lower factory had a similar kind of traffic. Now, there are 3 conspicuous civic buildings that Gilbert and Bennett either built themselves, or they provided the land, said, here, I'll do this, I'll help you build it. But all of them have very similar dates. They're in this period after 1902 to 1915. And by the way, the big sort of trapezoid building that you see first at Gilbert and Bennett now, the one that's across from the Granite Church, that one is 1913. And the one next to it is 1906. So a lot of that stuff was built right around that time, because that was the period when Gilbert and Bennett was expanding and was most successful. It went from an employment level of maybe about 150, 170 people, like around 1890, and then by 1906, 1910, it was almost triple that. So they were really on a growth spurt. Things were going great. So they expanded, they brought in more steam engines. That hydro business became more like, oh, we just need a little bit, you know. We need some water. By the way, we'll dump our chemicals in the river. And, oh yeah, no one will mind. It'll be okay, you know. So keep this image in mind, because the next image is almost exactly like it. Watch this little train here. That was 1906. Then they built some more buildings, 1908, same train. Same train. And then this is the office building, the little rustic office that's still standing opposite the granite, right? Okay, and the waterfall way up there. So this whole section became the upper factory. And it still doesn't have that big trapezoid building, which is the most prominent one that you see now. Okay, that was 1908, 1910. This is the view from Meadow Ridge, which was I didn't know this, it was the dairy farm of the business. Gilbert had a farm, and the farm became Meadow Ridge. Okay, so what's notable here, though, is when you're looking from that angle at this time, look how much is not there. This is not a really built-up place, even though those earlier images made it look very robust. If you, from this angle, there's not a whole lot going on. You can see, by the way, you can see that's the office building, the small office, and the granite churches over there. So there's quite a lot going on, but not much development in the foreground. Okay. So things were still looking good for the company, and they wanted to get their workers involved. And by the way, when they made these, like the school and the church and the office buildings, those were gestures of civic pride. But we don't really know to what extent the management was really motivated by the desire to create a marvelous civic display, as other places did. Some of these companies in other places really wanted to put a show on. And they would get the best architects, and they would make everything, you know, look pretty, and they get the rows, and they get their avenues, and we've got our hierarchy, you know, the workers are here, the managers are there, and the owners are up there, or maybe they're somewhere else entirely. But here it seemed to be more incremental, more kind of, not quite improvisational, but maybe more organic. One program they had, which these documents confirm, was a plan to help people with mortgages for the houses that were on, I forget the name of it, the street that's on the other side of the mill pond. Portland Street, thank you so much, on Portland Street. So you could buy a house and the company would help you with the mortgage. And by the way, if you read closely, it's going to be a great deal, bring your wife. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the workers themselves. Okay, this is going to go a little faster on this. This is a current, like late, let's say in the 1950s, the company had photo ID badges for everybody. And these are the photo IDs that the company made. It makes an interesting grid. We'll come back to that in a second. But there aren't really that many images of workers inside factories that anyone can find. What you see more typically is workers outside of factories, or workers in some other mode. This set of images, these are ambrotypes made in 1852 approximately at Amoskeag, which was in Manchester, New Hampshire. So here, these are all the employees in the, I think, the weave room of one part of the Amoskeag company. But to make this fantastic image, and by the way, a lot of them have, like, you know, rosy cheeks and little add-ons, that kind of thing. Each person would come to the studio and have their image taken at the studio, because that's how things were done then. This was the first 15 years of photography. You know, we had the daguerreotype, then the ambrotype, and the tintype. These are the ambrotypes.
They didn't smile. They didn't smile.
Well, yeah, and you couldn't. You had to, like, don't move.
It wasn't the thing, right?
Yeah, right. No smiling, no teeth, all of that. So if you saw an image of workers at all, it would be more likely to see them in a studio setting, like the one on the left. Both of these were the studio pictures. Bring your shuttles, you know, and come over, you know, go to the studio over there. A lot of these towns had one, and you would make a date and have your picture taken. Sometimes we know exactly when it was taken. These are both in Amoskeag. This one I know to be 1878. Fantastic image in the mill yard. Amoskeag had a robust program of documentary documenting their work, mostly focusing on, just pictures of machines and things like that. But every now and then, you'd see people. Or the people would pose outside, like this group at the boot mill, which is in Lowell. Again, the women are holding their shuttles, and they've got their scissors, like hanging from a little string around the neck. Tremendous wealth of detail in these pictures. So fantastic. Salmon Falls, which is in New Hampshire near the border with Maine. So if you went inside, you would pose people and have them sit down. Okay? Hold still, sit down, and stop production. I think this picture is a little bit dark. This one was done also in Manchester. And one of the earliest ways to get an image inside a mill, the images that we can actually look at, was through what was called stereoopticon, which was a huge popular vogue from 1880 to about 1915 or 20 or so. You put the thing in a little holder and hold it up, and you see a stereo image. Well, these stereo cards were often almost like documentary photography, where they would allow the photographer to come in and say, sure, take your pictures, fine. And sometimes they would actually have a date. So we know that this was 1873, which is very early for a photograph inside a mill because it's dark in there. Okay? Another one from Lawrence showing the print works. Again, you can see that they've stopped. So like, we're going to take our picture now. Everyone stop. But it's still a little bit candid because you've got like, there's this guy working underneath. And here's this guy kind of leaning in from the side. The overseers or the bosses have their suits and ties. Whenever we talk about photographs inside factories, we must acknowledge the absolutely crucial work of Lewis Hine, who came to New England in 3 different trips, or 3 different periods, 08, 16, and 24. He did a lot of other things. His work was primarily focused on child labor. He was employed by the Child Labor Reform Council, and he went to so many factories around here, focusing entirely on the children and their families, and recording as many facts as he could. The names, the ages, the heights, he would sort of guess about how old they were, he would do what he could, and so this was a typical kind of write-up that went with his photographs. He would kind of editorialize about how bad it was for children to be working in factories and that sort of thing. Winchendon, which is in central Mass near the New Hampshire border. This woman's name is Adrienne Pagnette. These guys, our lads, are in New Bedford sweeping. Now, we're moving on, no longer Lewis Hine, but still looking inside factories. There are a couple other examples. There's one group of mill girls in Lowell that other people have found. I say we, my colleagues have found there. The Cheney silk mill was a tremendous success and a great curiosity in Manchester. As you know, that's like northeast of Hartford, a little bit off of Route 84 as you go east from Hartford. So they went in there with a stereo camera and recorded different parts of the silk trade because it was so exotic. And the Cheney mill in Manchester also had its own mill village. Okay, so back at Lawrence and the print works, this is like kind of the same idea, but a much more posed and carefully managed photograph. Everyone down here has their coats and ties. Everyone is like ready, okay? No one is working. Hold still, there's our photographer, we're gonna do this, make it look good. A lovely set of pictures has been discovered recently in Amesbury, showing women working in the mills in 1913. So this is the same time period that Lewis Hine was photographing the children. You can see how very different the aesthetic is and probably the experience of the workers as well. Because we don't look at that and say, well, they look like exploited workers. Probably not. They look like they were working hard, though. I agree with that part of it. Okay, so a couple other examples of this kind of inside the factory work, and I will kind of sprint along here. These are both Amaskey in Manchester. Hein went back to Cheney in 1924. He had done some other things in between, and now he was coming back to look for examples of better situations. So he went to Cheney and said, I think this is better. And so he described it as favorable working conditions and made pictures of that were more beguiling in a way, more sort of friendly and accessible. Okay, now, a little bit about Gilbert and Bennett itself, the workers at Gilbert and Bennett. Julie Hughes, who was in charge of the archive of G&B images and records and so forth, found several of these for me. Here's one, 43, again, outside. Kind of a hokey promo picture from 1948. These people were arriving for a company party, so that's why they're all dressed up in 55. This, I think, is a really key image because we know the date, and you can see the looms. And note how, and also, we've got belt drive, see it up there? That's the shaft, that's the leather belt that comes down there. There's another shaft and belt over here. But these things are operating like with chains to lift the heddles up and down. And not like little leather things, but real chains. This is serious hardware. This is, I think, like the patent tank as opposed to the horse or something, a smaller fabric loom. These are, serious machines because the work is so difficult. Okay. Another wire worker in 81. Bruce Ando was here for several visits and we made a fantastic collection of photographs, of which this is one, 1989. Okay, now I'm going to show you a few pictures of my own. We'll be kind of near the end of this presentation. There'll be a Q&A at the end, by the way. Okay, so in the 70s, I went all around, not all around, I went to many places in New England, photographing textile mill workers, especially at these small hydro sites, but I also went to some of the larger ones, like the Lowell and Lawrence and Manchester, did a bunch of that. I'm going to show you some examples of these pictures. Oh, don't do that. I go back. There. Okay, we're going to go there, and my assistant Cecilia is going to help me after because I recorded some interviews with these people at the same time. Okay, and he's got that there. Okay, good. So. This guy was a fabric weaver. Okay, another weaver. Okay. Yeah, there's another piece that went with this. Okay, so this guy was at the stamina mills in Forestdale, which burned down shortly after. It is now a toxic waste dump. Arbica webbing. These are narrow fabric weavers, rather like the photograph that's on the side over there. Also at Arbica. Okay, and I'm going to ask Cecilia to read a quote from this woman. Read this while I check. I think it's this one. Is it this one? It is not. Okay. Okay, so that's a quote from Beatrice.
I'm not bragging, but I was never a sloppy sewer. I was conscientious. I had to fix everything. In the end, it pays because they kept me right until the end. I hope I never have to go back. I hope I never work again, period. I worked enough, from 16 right up to 62. That's enough.
Thank you, Cecilia. I found my little cue card here. So I'm going to go back. Okay, so what do we have here? To Joe, okay? So what he said to me was this. When it comes to weaving, I just like to look at yards and yards of perfect cloth. That's how I get my satisfaction. All my life, my whole object was to make a piece of cloth that was perfect continuously. Mm-hmm. That's this guy. And one more of these, John, okay? John Valeriana. Notice, by the way, a lot of ethnic background names here. Okay, so John says, I've been a weaver ever since '46. As it turned out, it was the best job I ever had, although it was one of the roughest. There was a lot of responsibility. Quality is the prime subject. To me, the loom, you can tell if it's functioning right just by the sound. There's no problem learning to weave if you put your mind to it. Basically speaking, weaving isn't the worst job, but you gotta watch everything. So these are the kinds of things that people would say to me, and I just, each time I said, man, I don't believe I'm hearing this. I'm trying to write it down, try not to make too many mistakes. I sometimes had a tape recorder that helped me out. So that was the kind of work I was doing in the 70s. There, again at Forestdale. This is a braid mill in Pawtucket. It's hard to find her, but there's your worker right there. A good example of a braid is a shoelace. You say, well, what are they making? They make shoelaces. Okay. A loom fixer in Lowell. This is what they call this the creel. This is where you rack up the yarn before it goes onto the beam. This image is duplicated over there. Again, narrow fabric mill. A good example of a narrow fabric would be like an ace bandage or an automobile seat belt is a narrow fabric. Okay, this is a mule spinner in Maine. And another spinner also in Maine. And just to give you an idea of why do these images resonate? So this one reminds us a lot of that one, even though I didn't really set out to duplicate it. It's more like I'm in the same kind of a place. I'm using a camera that's kind of down here. I used a Hasselblad on a tripod, so the camera's about here. So the camera's low. You have window light coming in from the side. You've got a long row of machines. And so the images they echo. It's like one rhymes with the other. And in fact, I thought, well, that would make a nice book cover. So I put it on the cover of a book that I published, of which I have a copy over there. You're free to look at it after the presentation. This woman's name is Alice. Alice, in French you say Veilleux. She would probably say Velux. V-E-I-L-L-E-U-X. Okay, so now just a little bit more on G&B, and then we'll jump into the Q&A part. Okay, so a couple key facts. Terrible flood in 1955. Now, it wasn't just here, it was everywhere. So the flood of '55, if you start looking through the records, Google it, around Connecticut, so many of these factory towns were blown away in '55. And you say, well, why was that? Well, partly it was a big storm. But the other part is that the factories are in these valleys. They're put there on purpose because that's where you get the most advantage of the height of the water coming down. Well, as long as everything is stable, that's a great idea. But when you've got too much water, it could be a disaster. So the flood of '55 was a disaster here. The hurricane of '38 was a disaster in Rhode Island. Hurricane Gloria was another kind of disaster, for other parts of Massachusetts. This pattern repeats over and over again because of the location. It's like, now we talk a lot about flood risk. You say, well, you can't put your house like right next to the ocean because it'll be, we don't want to have to rescue you. Well, they put these factories in an equally risky place. Looked great most of the time, but everybody knew that every 25 years a great flood would come along, and a freshet, they would say. It just means like, whoa, the water's coming. Okay, so '55, big blowout, and it blew. This is the dam, by the way, the very same dam. The dam is there. The blowout happened adjacent to the dam. It went around and came out the other side. Okay. So that was a bad scene. Okay. I was able to go inside one part of the factory in '06, again visiting my uncle, and the company had already been bankrupt for like 8 years at the time. I think the bankruptcy maybe was final in '95, '98, something like that. But some of the machines were still there. They just hadn't cleared them all out. And so I was able to walk around and make some photographs. These are some samples. Okay, that was one of the weave rooms in the basement. Close up of the loom. They're obviously putting stuff on pallets, preparing to take it out. This is some of the product in the foreground. Okay, it's like what we make right there. Okay. woven wire. That's the Trapezoid building with all of its windows intact. Yeah. It's still a remarkable building. It just needs some love. Okay, I took some aerial photographs 2 weeks ago when I came here for a little preview. This is one drone picture. And in a moment I'll show you another angle on this, but this is the 1913 edition here. The office building is here. The Granite Church would be down there. The waterfall is up there. Okay, one more advance. Okay, so now the circle shows you, again, where the waterfall is. And it's a reminder that most of the development was way up there for most of those decades. Everything here was added after 1900, that part. So you've got, and the lower factory, of course, is like, it's a mile down the road down there, so it's not even in this picture. It's just a reminder of how the business developed at different places at different times and had a different sort of arc because of the floods and the fires and the rebuilds and all those things that happened over this very long time period. Okay, Julia Pemberton is your select woman. She took me for a tour on the one I visited a couple weeks ago. This is the building, the building that adjoins it, by the way. There's the last leather belt right there. It's amazing how long they kept those things. Of course, most of the machines would be powered by electric motors. And there's an electric substation on the side of the site because they were also galvanizing. And I think that to do that, you need electricity to do that. I think that's a great big vat of zinc and a lot of electricity. Yeah, in the river, right? Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up by showing you just a little bit of some of what I do there. That's my website right there. I have a portfolio of these pictures, an archival silver gel portfolio. If you're interested, just ask me. I want to thank all the people who helped me out, including Lane and Julia, Brent, who is a fountain of historical information, Julie, who superintends, or she's the librarian of the collection, which is inside the office building. Bruce helped me with a couple photographs, and Mark helped put the whole thing together. So I thank all of them for all of that, and I think we're going to end with that picture there, which is the staff, the employee documentary, badge pictures from probably the 1950s. And at that point, I'll say thank you very much.